Hello and welcome back to this mobile DevOps series. In this video, we're finally going to be distributing our Xamarin application to iOS devices. Now again, I've been using Xamarin just because it allows me to build for both Android and iOS at the same time, but this is going to be exactly the same for those of you native iOS developers and React Native developers when distributing the iOS application. So far, we have already distributed the Android version of the application. That is what we covered in the previous video. We're going to be doing something very similar for iOS. So we're going to be creating a distribution group and we're going to be distributing directly through App Center. So no, we are not going to be using the App Store in this video. If you're interested on that, that is actually something that I cover on my full course. That is down below in the description. There is an iOS version, Android version, Xamarin version, and React Native version. But that is not why you're here. You're here because you want to distribute your iOS application. So what I will do first and foremost is navigate over to the iOS application here on App Center. Now remember that by now we already have the code over on a GitHub repository, and I'm using GitHub, but your repository could be somewhere else, for example Bitbucket. And I'm using some pull requests that we've already noticed automatically generate some builds. So this is continuous integration. We already have continuous integration working here on this iOS application. The next step, of course, is to enable continuous delivery. And similar to what we did on Android, everything is going to start over on the Distribute tab by creating a brand new distribution group. So again, we're going to be using App Center to distribute the applications to, for example, beta testers. So a list of people that we know, we perhaps have their email address or we know how to get their application to them. So not exactly our end users, but perhaps someone who can help us test our application. And that is exactly what I'm going to be creating in here. In fact, I am going to be adding a group that is going to be called beta testers. And the only thing that I want to do in here is add an email. Now I am going to be using one of my emails, but of course in here you would be able to add as many emails as you need. So my 10 days of Xamarin.blog email in here and simply create group. Now by this time, all of the beta testers, or in this scenario just one beta tester, myself, would have received an invitation to start testing my DevOps example for iOS application, which is where I have just created the distribution group. But of course, by now they wouldn't see any release because we haven't created any release. Eventually though, they will receive also a notification every single time a new release is made available. So that is exactly what we're going to be doing now, creating a new release. However, on iOS there is an additional very important thing to do. And that is to register devices. It turns out that when we create an application, Apple is going to be very wary about who can install that application because we don't want a bad developer creating some malware and making it available for everyone to install. So Apple makes it a bit harder for us to install our application on certain devices. We actually have to know what devices are going to be running our application. Now that can be a bit tricky because we may not have direct contact with all of our beta testers. Perhaps all we do is have their email address. Thankfully, App Center makes it very easy for us to register those devices. So noticing here in the beta testers group, over on the devices tab, is this configuration kind of icon over here to the top right. In here, we can enable App Center or the beta testers distribution group in this case to automatically manage the devices. This is key. If we do not enable this, other users wouldn't be able to run our application. But as soon as we here select our Apple developer account, of course we have here the add account button, so we can add our Apple developer account and eventually select the certificate. Once we have that, App Center is going to manage everything for us. Now I've already connected my Apple developer account. It does show as invalid, so I will have to reconnect it. But once I do that, I should be good to go. Of course, in your case, you may have to click Add Account instead of Reconnect. Once you have your Apple developer account, the next step is to select a certificate. Now, I already have some certificates in here, but of course, let's create it from the ground up. So I will navigate over to developer.apple.com. And in here, we're going to have to navigate over to our account. Of course, that means that we will have to sign in with the same account that we just connected over to App Center. And then navigate over here to certificates, identifiers, and profiles. And we're going to be creating that certificate that we are going to need. So in here, simply click on Add and select that you want an Apple distribution certificate. So notice that there is also an Apple development certificate. That is something that you would use if you're in the development process. But right now we're already distributing our application. So we want to create an Apple distribution certificate. Now, just in case you might still be using Xcode 10 or earlier, which by this time may not be the case of anyone, but just in case, you will have to select iOS distribution instead of Apple distribution. Just keep that in mind. But if you're already using Xcode 11 or later, select Apple distribution, click on Continue, and you're going to have to create a CSR file. Now, the CSR file is something that you can only create directly from your Mac. You will have to open the keychain access application that exists inside of your Mac. Again, this is why it is entirely required that you use a Mac for this process. And navigate over to the keychain access menu here to the top left, select Certificate Assistant, and select Request a Certificate from a Certificate Authority. Then simply select Save to Disk, click on Continue, click on Save, and the CSR file would have been creating on wherever place you selected, in my case, desktop. So back here on the certificates, identifiers, and profiles, you can select that file. In my case, go over to the desktop, select the file, click on Open, and click on Continue. These will allow you to create the certificate, and notice that we can now download the certificate. However, this is currently a CER file. That is not what we have to upload in here. If you please select Apple certificate and click on that certificate. Notice that it requires a P12 file, not a CER file. So what we will have to do is click on this file, the CER file that has just been downloaded, which will install the file on our keychain access. So open the keychain access again and navigate over to My Certificates. In here, you're going to find a certificate that expires a year from now. So if today is November 6th, 2019, I now have the certificate that expires on November 6th, 2020. This is a certificate that I have just created. Now, if you only see one certificate, it may be easier for you to identify it, but you can also identify it through the expiration date. It's a bit easier as you get more and more certificates. Now, expand that certificate that you have just identified and select both the certificate and the private key. Right-click on this selection and select Export to Items. Select where this is going to live. In my case, I am again going to be selecting desktop, and notice that finally a P12 file is going to be created. Click on Save and assign a password. Do not forget this password. Click on OK, allow your Mac to do its thing, and that will be it. Finally, you can navigate back to App Center and select that P12 file that now lives in your desktop or wherever you selected, and set the password that you have just created, just so App Center can open the certificate. And that's it. You have now assigned a certificate for distribution for this particular distribution group. Now, the distribution group will be able to update with the corresponding device the provisioning profile. Now, wait a minute, we haven't talked about provisioning profiles just yet. That is the next step. So now that our beta testers distribution group is going to be signing or adding the devices of our beta testers through that certificate that we have just uploaded, we can navigate back to the build tab and configure the build for our master branch differently. Finally, we're going to be enabling continuous delivery, which means that we are going to be distributing our application. So in here, the first thing that we have to change is the configuration. This is no longer going to be debug. This now has to be release. I optionally can change the Xcode version. Do notice that if you created an Apple certificate back here in the certificates, identifiers, and profiles, this has to be 11 or later. If you created iOS certificate, this has to be 10 or earlier. Then we're going to be finally building for device, not for simulator. These builds will finally be able to run on devices. However, that means that we will have to sign the build. And noticing here, when signing the build here, we need a provisioning profile. Now, before moving forward and creating the provisioning profile, notice that there is also a certificate being required. And we already have the certificate. We already have that p12 file. So let's upload that same certificate. It is important that this is the exact same certificate that you created. I mentioned this because eventually you may have more than one certificate, one for development and one for distribution. So make sure that you use the same certificate that you have just assigned for the distribution group. And of course, set the password. So there it is, the certificate. Now on to the provisioning profile. The provisioning profile is a bit more interesting because there can be a bit more versions of this provisioning profile. Now, before we move forward into this, let me navigate over to my repository and show you over on the iOS project that I have this info.plist file. And the info.plist file is going to contain inside of it a CF bundle identifier that in my case reads com.lalorosas.devops example. Make sure that you grab that string. This is the identifier, unique identifier for your application. Because this is unique, that is why you normally want to use a reverse URL, something like yourdomain.com, but instead of domain.com, that would be com.domain, and then the name of your application. But just make sure that you copy this string and navigate over to the certificates, identifiers, and profiles again. We're going to start by navigating over to identifiers and creating a brand new app ID, which means that our application is finally going to be identified with Apple through that bundle ID that we have just copied directly from the info.plist. And optionally add some description. Optionally add some capabilities. In my case, I do not need to add any of this. Click and continue. And click on register. So we now have this ID. Our application now has a name, an identifier. Now we can create the profile. So navigate over to profiles, create add, and because we're already distributing, we're going to be selecting add hoc. But notice that eventually you may have more than one provisioning profile. When you're developing, for example, you may want an iOS app development. Right now that we are distributing through App Center, we want an ad hoc distribution profile. But eventually, when you distribute to the App Store, you may need an App Store distribution. So eventually, you may have a few different provisioning profiles. In our scenario right now, we just want an ad hoc distribution because we're not distributing to the store, but we are distributing, we're no longer just developing. So click on continue and select the app ID that we have just created. So in my case, DevOps example, and click on continue. Now in here, we need to select a certificate. Again, it is important that you select the certificate that you have just added to the distribution group and that your build is going to be using. So in my case, that is this one right here that expires in a year, November 6th, 2020, and click on continue. In here, notice that you can select devices that are going to be able to install whatever application is signed with this provisioning profile. That is why it is very important to set App Center to help us add devices to this provisioning profile, because right now we may only see our own device. For example, let's say that this right here is my device. We would only be able to select it from this list. However, if someone new tries to install our application, it is going to be a bit hard for us to register that device over and over again with this provisioning profile. However, because over on App Center we have already set our distribution group to add those devices automatically, we won't need to worry about this. So simply select one of the devices from here. It doesn't matter really which one you select, click on continue and set a name. Now, I do recommend that you set a name like this one, the name of your application, then a doc and dist, just so you know that this is a distribution ad hoc provisioning profile. Again, just because eventually you may have a development and an app store distributions and so on, so it is easy to identify one provisioning profile from another. Finally, just click on create, click on download, and you have this mobile provision file, which is exactly the one that App Center is requesting. So I simply select my mobile provision file that I have right here, and that is it. We're going to be able to sign this build. Since the build will already be signed, we can distribute the build. And of course, we see groups, we see store. Right now we're going to be distributing to a group, which is our beta testers group. And that's it. We can click on save, and we have now enabled continuous delivery for our application. The setup is complete. Now that we have everything set up, it is time to test if this is actually true. So what I'm going to do to trigger a brand new build is to just come here to my code and create a new feature branch. Let's say that this is going to be feature 3. I think that is the next branch that we have to create. Of course, normally you may want to create this directly from the IDE, but let's just say that we're going to be doing it from here, and I'm not even going to be generating a super feature. All I'm going to do is edit the README file and just write some crap in here, something random. The feature is not important. What I want to do is just trigger a new build. Just trigger a new build. Of course, normally do not do this, actually code a feature, but I just want to commit something new to a new branch just so I can create a new pull request. So I can create a pull request that is going to be merging feature 3 into master. I know that as soon as I create the pull request over on App Center and over on the master branch, a new pull request build is going to be triggered. Right here we see it building. And of course, that is going to update back these couple of checks, one for Android, one for iOS. Let's not focus on the Android one anymore. But as soon as this build finishes, we will be able to merge into the master branch, which will trigger the automatic build. And it is that automatic build, the one that is also going to trigger continuous delivery. So let me just skip ahead until I have all of those builds complete and show you how that new delivery, new version, new release has been made available. And here it is. So the pull request build has built, of course, and then I merged, and then there is this automatic build. Now, like I mentioned, it is this automatic build, the one that triggers the continuous delivery process, which means that over in the distribute tab, we will now find this brand new release that has been made available to our beta testers. So in fact, if we navigate over to groups and select that group, we will see that there is a new release available. And if what I told you was true, the entire list of testers should have received a notification letting them know that there is this brand new release. So let me jump over here to this iOS device to show you the process for all of these testers to follow so they can actually install your application. So here I have my iPhone, and as you can see, indeed I have a couple of notifications from App Center. The first one is the invitation that I mentioned, that this user, this beta tester, received as soon as we added them to the beta testers group. This was a few minutes ago. But of course, at that point, there weren't any releases. However, later, the second notification arrived, letting them, all of those beta testers, know that there is a new version of that application for iOS available. So if they were to click on install, they would be navigated over to the list. Now, very important, when you click on install, make sure that Safari on this iOS device is opened. If by default another browser is opened, just make sure that you long press, click on copy the entire link, and make sure that you use Safari to open this link. So let me just paste here that link and navigate over to that website. Of course, the user will have to log in with the credentials. In this case, for example, for the 10 days of Xamarin.blog email, that can be GitHub, Microsoft, Gmail, or some other account. But as soon as they have signed in, notice what they're going to see. They're going to be navigated to the application that you shared with them, and they will now see this brand new release. However, before they do anything else, before they try to install, they have to register the device, which we know that App Center is going to do automatically, but your users will have to follow a quick process. So first and foremost, they will have to navigate over to the top right to their profile, and they will have to click on Add New Device. Click on Allow, and that is going to download a profile to their phones. And now they will have to navigate over to Settings, and over on Settings, they will now find this Profile Downloaded option, and they will have to install the profile. Now, just in case they do not see that profile, they will have to navigate over to General, then go down below over to Profile, and here they should see that App Center device registration profile from Microsoft that has just been downloaded. Again, they will have to click on that profile and click on Install. As soon as the profile is installed, this device is going to be registered with your provisioning profile, which means that this device will now be able to run your application. So finally, they will be able to navigate to those applications and click on Install. The iOS application is going to be downloaded just as any other application, for example, from the App Store. And we will see it right here on the Springboard. It is going to be loaded, it is going to be installed. Since the device has been registered, it is installed correctly. We click on it and we see our amazing application now installed here on an iOS device. So excellent, that is exactly how you would be able to install that application, or rather all of your testers or all of your users from a distribution group would be able to install that application on their device. Now you will be able to navigate over to the overview and see that there is now one installation. So this is how you enable continuous delivery through a distribution group on App Center for your iOS applications. Again, just like I quickly mentioned at the beginning, to release to a store would be slightly different. You will have to do some other things, and that is actually covered on my full course. So if you're interested on knowing how to do that and much more things, such as running unit and UI tests here in App Center, go over to the description of this video and check out my various DevOps for mobile courses that I have listed down below. I have one for Android developers, one for iOS developers, one for Xamarin, and even one for React Native developers down below. So if you're interested, check out the links in the description. See you in the next one.